September 1929, New York City. The night air was cold, and the streets of Manhattan were almost empty. Inside a parked car, a man sat bleeding. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. He was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America, and only hours earlier, he had been told that he was finally safe. But Maranzano had made one mistake. He trusted the wrong people. When the men entered his office, they were not police officers. They were not rival gangsters coming to negotiate. They were killers. Within minutes, Maranzano would be dead. And behind that murder was a man who understood something most gangsters never did. The old mafia was built on fear, but the future would be built on organization. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano. To the public, he would become one of the most famous gangsters in American history. But Luciano did not simply rise through violence. He helped redesign the American underworld. He brought rival gangs together. He turned criminals into businessmen, and he helped create a system that could survive even when individual bosses disappeared. But there was a question that would follow him for the rest of his life. How did a poor immigrant boy from Sicily become one of the most powerful men in organized crime? The answer begins years before the bloodshed, long before the murders, long before the mafia empire. It begins with a young boy arriving in America with almost nothing. Salvatore Lucania was born in Sicily in 1897. His family lived in a poor town called Lercrafritti. His father worked hard, but there was little money. America represented something different. Opportunity. So when Salvatore was still a teenager, his family moved to New York. They settled in Manhattan's Lower East Side, a crowded world of tenements, street vendors, immigrant families, and neighborhood gangs. For a young boy like Salvatore, the streets were a classroom, and the lessons were brutal. Money mattered, reputation mattered, and weakness could be dangerous. He quickly learned how to survive. But unlike many young criminals around him, Salvatore was not obsessed with becoming the toughest fighter on the block. He was watching, learning, studying people. He noticed who had money, who had connections, who controlled the neighborhood, and most importantly, who was afraid of whom. That instinct would eventually become his greatest weapon. As a teenager, he began getting involved in small-time crime, gambling, street theft, protection schemes, anything that could bring in money. But Salvatore was also building relationships. Among the young criminals he met was another ambitious teenager named Meyer Lansky. Lansky was Jewish, intelligent, and deeply involved in gambling. The two young men came from different backgrounds, but they understood each other. They both saw crime differently, not simply as street violence, but as a business. That friendship would become extremely important, because while other gangsters were fighting over territory, Luciano and Lansky were thinking about something much bigger. How could criminals make money without constantly killing each other? The answer would eventually change organized crime in America. But first, there was another force transforming the country: Prohibition. In 1920, the United States banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages. Politicians believed they were protecting American society. Instead, they created one of the most profitable criminal markets in history. Suddenly, millions of ordinary people wanted something that was illegal, and criminals were ready to supply it. Whiskey, gin, beer. Bootlegging became a fortune-making business, and Luciano understood the opportunity almost immediately. He began moving closer to powerful underworld figures. One of them was Arnold Rothstein, a wealthy gambler and crime financier who understood money better than almost anyone in New York. Rothstein was different from the old-style gangsters. He didn't need to stand on a street corner with a gun. He operated through connections, money, information, influence. For Luciano, men like Rothstein were an education. He learned that the most powerful criminal did not necessarily have to pull the trigger. Sometimes the real power belonged to the man who controlled the people who did. By the early 1920s, Luciano was becoming increasingly important. But the New York underworld was changing too. Two rival factions were fighting for control. On one side stood Joe Masseria, a traditional Sicilian mafia boss. On the other was Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful Sicilian leader. Their conflict became known as the Castellammarese War. It was supposed to determine who would control New York's mafia. Instead, it created an opportunity for Luciano, because Luciano belonged to a younger generation. He and men like Lansky were not interested in old traditions that forced criminals into endless wars. They wanted money, they wanted expansion, and they wanted freedom to work with whoever could make them richer. But there was a problem. The older bosses did not trust them. They saw Luciano's generation as disrespectful, too modern, too willing to work with outsiders, and perhaps worst of all, too independent. Luciano understood the danger. He knew that if the old bosses continued fighting, eventually someone would come after him. So he made a decision. He would stop choosing sides. He would create his own side. By the middle of the 1920s, Luciano had become a key figure among New York's younger criminals. He worked with Meyer Lansky. He became connected to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. He crossed paths with Frank Costello, and he developed relationships with other rising gangsters who would later become legendary names in American organized crime. These men were different from the older mafia bosses. They were willing to work across ethnic lines. Italian, Jewish, Irish. They cared less about tradition and more about profit, and that made them dangerous. Luciano's growing influence eventually attracted the attention of Joe Masseria. Masseria wanted loyalty. Luciano wanted freedom. Those two ideas could not exist peacefully for long. Then came the moment that changed everything. Masseria demanded that Luciano remain loyal to the old order. Luciano realized that obedience would eventually destroy him. So he began making secret moves. He met with rivals. He strengthened his relationships with Lansky and other allies. And quietly, he prepared for war. But Luciano had not yet become the king of New York. He still had one enormous obstacle, Joe Masseria, and Luciano knew that defeating Masseria would require more than courage. It would require betrayal. On April 15, 1931, Masseria sat down for what appeared to be an ordinary meal at a restaurant in Coney Island. He had no idea that the people around him were about to disappear. According to the traditional account, Luciano left the table. Moments later, gunmen entered. Masseria was shot and killed. The war was over. Luciano had helped remove the man who stood between him and power. But he had made a dangerous assumption. He believed that once Masseria was gone, the old mafia system would finally accept the new generation. He was wrong, because another boss was waiting, Salvatore Maranzano. And Maranzano had his own vision for the future. A vision that looked suspiciously like the old world Luciano was trying to destroy. Within months, Luciano would discover that winning a mafia war was one thing. Surviving the peace was something else. And the next betrayal would be even more shocking. Maranzano had won the war. At least, that was what it looked like. With Joe Masseria dead, Salvatore Maranzano stood at the top of New York's criminal world. He declared himself the head of the city's Italian mafia and began reorganizing the families beneath him. But Maranzano had misunderstood the man standing beside him. Lucky Luciano had not helped destroy Masseria, so another dictator could take his place. He had done it because he wanted something completely different. Luciano wanted a system where powerful criminals could cooperate without constantly fighting over who was superior. Maranzano wanted hierarchy. Luciano wanted business. And those two visions were about to collide. Maranzano reportedly modeled his organization on the old Sicilian structure. Bosses answered upward. Soldiers answered their bosses. Respect was demanded. Luciano saw the danger immediately. If Maranzano became too powerful, everyone beneath him would eventually become his prisoner. And Luciano refused to become anyone's prisoner. There was another problem. Maranzano did not fully trust Luciano. He knew Luciano had helped arrange Masseria's downfall. That meant Luciano was useful, but it also meant Luciano was dangerous. A man capable of betraying one powerful boss could eventually betray another. Maranzano reportedly began discussing the possibility of eliminating Luciano. The younger gangster learned about the plan before it could happen. And now the game changed. Luciano was no longer trying to survive a mafia war. He was trying to redesign the entire underworld before the underworld destroyed him. In September 1931, Maranzano summoned Luciano to his office in Manhattan. The meeting was supposed to be about business. Instead, it became a death sentence. But Maranzano never got the chance to carry it out. Men entered his office disguised as government agents. They confronted him. Then they attacked. Maranzano was stabbed and shot to death. The old order had lost its leader, and Luciano had survived. But what happened next was even more important than the murder itself. Luciano did not simply take Maranzano's position. He refused to become another Maranzano. Instead, he helped create what became known as the Commission. The idea was simple. Instead of one mafia boss controlling everyone, the major crime families would have a council. Disputes could be discussed. Territories could be negotiated. Business could be divided. And wars could be prevented before they became disasters. It was a radical idea. For decades, organized crime had been driven by pride, revenge, blood, and personal loyalty. Luciano was replacing those emotions with structure. That was his genius. He understood that violence made money possible, but too much violence destroyed money. Every dead gangster created police attention. Every war interrupted gambling. Every public murder threatened bootlegging operations. Luciano wanted crime to become quieter, more efficient, more professional. The streets might still be violent, but behind closed doors, the real business would be controlled by negotiation. Among the men who benefited from this new system were Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and other influential criminals. Lansky was especially important. He had known Luciano since their youth, and the two men shared a similar belief that organized crime could operate like a corporation. Lansky understood gambling. Luciano understood people. Together, they could build connections across different criminal groups. But there was another man who would become central to Luciano's future: Frank Costello. Costello was known for his political connections and calm manner. Unlike the stereotypical gangster, he understood that influence did not always require violence. A phone call could sometimes accomplish what a gun could not. That philosophy fit perfectly with Luciano's new organization. For a moment, it appeared that Luciano had achieved the impossible. He had survived the mafia wars. He had eliminated his most dangerous rivals. He had helped reorganize the criminal world. And now enormous amounts of money were flowing through the system. But there was one enemy Luciano could not control: the government. Federal authorities had spent years struggling to understand organized crime. Gangsters often escaped serious punishment because witnesses disappeared, evidence was weak, and corruption was everywhere. But one prosecutor was about to change that. His name was Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was ambitious. He was aggressive, and unlike many investigators before him, he understood that attacking individual gangsters would not be enough. He wanted to follow the money. He wanted to understand the system. And eventually, that system led him toward Lucky Luciano. By the early 1930s, Luciano was living a life that seemed almost impossible for a man from a poor immigrant family. He had expensive clothes, luxury apartments, fine restaurants, powerful friends. He moved through New York society while maintaining connections to the underworld. But the more visible he became, the more dangerous his position became. Luciano had spent years learning how to disappear behind other people. Now he was becoming famous. That fame was a weakness. Dewey began building a case around prostitution operations connected to Luciano's organization. The charges would become a turning point. But Luciano did not believe the government could actually bring him down. He had survived gang wars. He had survived rival bosses. He had survived assassination plots. He had built an organization powerful enough to influence criminals across New York. Why should a prosecutor be different? That confidence may have been his biggest mistake. In 1936, Luciano was arrested and charged with compulsory prostitution. The case became a major public spectacle. Dewey's prosecution team presented witnesses who described how organized prostitution operations generated money and how Luciano was connected to the system. The evidence was damaging. The courtroom atmosphere changed. For the first time, Luciano was not controlling the room. He was sitting inside it, waiting, watching, unable to negotiate his way out. The jury found him guilty. Luciano was sentenced to decades in prison. The man who had helped organize America's criminal underworld was now behind bars. But even from prison, he was not finished. His criminal empire did not collapse. His influence continued. His associates remained active. And Luciano still possessed something more powerful than money: information. He knew how the organization worked. He knew who owed favors. He knew which alliances mattered. He knew where the bodies were buried. And while the authorities believed they had finally removed him from the streets, history was about to give Luciano another opportunity. World War II was approaching. America was about to enter the greatest conflict of the 20th century. And suddenly, the imprisoned mafia boss could become useful to the very government that had put him behind bars. Because in wartime New York, the docks were critical. Ships carried soldiers, weapons, fuel, and supplies. Sabotage could be catastrophic. And the government needed information from people who understood the waterfront. People like the mafia. Luciano's connections to the docks suddenly became valuable. Behind prison walls, negotiations began. The details remained debated, but Luciano's contacts were reportedly used to help authorities gather intelligence and maintain security around the New York waterfront. For Luciano, this was an extraordinary reversal. Only years earlier, the government had called him a dangerous criminal. Now officials were willing to communicate with him. And Luciano understood something immediately. If the government needed him, then he still had power. But the greatest surprise was yet to come. Because Luciano was not simply fighting to leave prison. He was preparing for something much larger. He wanted his freedom. And once he got it, he wanted to return to the world he had built. But there was one thing Luciano could never control. The mafia was changing without him. And when he finally walked free, he would discover that the empire he created no longer belonged entirely to him. Lucky Luciano had spent years building an empire designed to survive without him. Now he was about to discover the price of that success. In 1946, after years behind bars, Luciano received a commutation of his sentence, but there was a condition. He had to leave America. The country where he had built his reputation would no longer be his home. Luciano was deported to Italy. For most men, exile would have meant defeat. For Luciano, it was simply another move. He settled in Naples and remained connected to American organized crime through trusted associates. But something had changed. He was no longer the young gangster who had walked through Manhattan streets believing he could control everything. His influence was real. His connections were still powerful. But the criminal world had learned how to operate without him. In America, men like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and other mafia leaders were fighting for influence. Luciano could advise. He could negotiate. He could still command respect. But he could not simply return and reclaim New York. The commission had become bigger than one man. And that was both Luciano's greatest achievement and his greatest loss. He had created a system that could survive its creator. For years, Luciano remained involved in international criminal affairs, particularly gambling and narcotics connections. His name continued to carry enormous weight. But the man himself was aging. The streets had changed. The politicians had changed. The mafia had changed. And America was no longer the America he had known in the 1920s. Then, on January 26, 1962, Luciano suffered a heart attack at Naples International Airport. He was only 64 years old. The man who had survived gang wars, assassination plots, prison, and exile was suddenly gone. There was no dramatic gunfight, no final mafia execution, no enemies standing over him. Just a heart attack, a quiet ending for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. But Luciano's real legacy was not the money. It was the structure. He helped transform American organized crime from competing street gangs into a coordinated network of criminal enterprises. He understood that violence was useful only when controlled. He understood that loyalty could be purchased, but systems lasted longer. And he understood something that many criminals never learn. Power is not always about being feared. Sometimes it is about making people believe they need you. Luciano never became the absolute king of the mafia. Instead, he became something more difficult to destroy, a designer of the system. His empire did not disappear when he went to prison. It did not disappear when he was deported. And it did not disappear when he died. That may be the darkest part of his story. Because Luciano's greatest victory was also his final disappearance. He built an organization powerful enough to continue without its founder. The name Lucky Luciano became legend, but the machine he helped create became reality. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. The most dangerous criminal is not always the man with the gun. Sometimes it is the man who realizes that the gun is only one small part of the business. Luciano understood that. He turned chaos into structure. He turned rivalries into negotiations. And he helped create a criminal system whose influence would outlive him by decades. He wanted an empire. What he ultimately created was a blueprint, and blueprints can survive the men who draw them.